Imagine opening your eyes one morning and realizing that the world around you is completely unfamiliar. Instead of the soft glow of your phone alarm, you are awakened by the harsh call of a rooster. Instead of the quiet hum of cars outside your window, you hear the uneven clatter of sandals on dirt roads and the distant sound of merchants shouting their wares. You sit up, only to realize you are not in your comfortable bedroom, but lying on a simple wooden bed inside a small, smoky house made of mud, brick, and plaster. The air is heavy with the smell of olive oil, unwashed bodies, and the faint, lingering odor of last night's fish stew. Congratulations, you have somehow traveled back in time to the world of ancient Greece, perhaps around the 5th century BCE, the so-called Golden Age of Athens. At first, it may sound exciting. After all, this was the era of great philosophers like Socrates and Plato, of dramatic playwrights like Sophocles and Euripides, of grand architecture like the Parthenon, and of legendary warriors like the Spartans. But the truth is that if you, a modern person, were dropped into this world, you almost certainly would not last even a single day. The first thing you would notice is the lack of what we now consider basic hygiene. Bathing was not a daily ritual for the average Greek. In fact, most people only washed occasionally, using olive oil scraped off the skin with a tool called a strigil. Soap, as we know it today, did not exist. Imagine trying to feel clean in the stifling Mediterranean heat when your best option is to smear oil on your body and scrape it off, while still smelling faintly of sweat, fish, and smoke. Your nose, accustomed to deodorant and running water, would be overwhelmed. The streets outside would be no better. Athens was crowded, narrow, and noisy. Garbage was tossed into the street or left in open pits where it rotted in the sun. Sewage systems were primitive at best, and in many places, people simply emptied chamber pots into the street. The combination of waste, animals, and thousands of unwashed people created an odor that modern city dwellers would find unbearable. As you stumble outside, trying not to gag, you would be hit by another shock: the sheer difference in daily life compared to the 21st century. The clothes on your body would be rough wool or linen, itchy and plain, likely a tunic called a chiton. If you are male, you might be allowed to wander freely into the marketplace, the agora, where men gathered to trade, debate, and socialize. If you are female, however, your life would be shockingly restricted. Ancient Greek society, especially in Athens, was deeply patriarchal. Women were expected to stay indoors, managing the household, weaving cloth, and raising children. They had little political or legal rights, could not vote, and were rarely seen in public without a male guardian. For a modern woman used to independence, the sudden loss of freedom would be devastating. Even the great thinkers of Greece, men like Aristotle, wrote dismissively about women, claiming they were naturally inferior to men. Imagine hearing that in person, not as a distant historical quote, but as an accepted truth of daily life. Hunger would soon follow shock. Ancient Greek diets were simple, heavily reliant on bread made from barley, olives, figs, cheese, and the occasional fish. Meat was rare, eaten mostly during religious festivals or sacrifices. For breakfast, you might be offered bread dipped in wine, not because the Greeks wanted to be tipsy in the morning, but because wine diluted with water was safer to drink than contaminated water. Coffee, tea, sugar, and chocolate were unknown. Imagine trying to survive a day without your morning caffeine or biting into bread so coarse it could chip a tooth. This was daily life, not an exotic diet plan. Malnutrition was common, and life expectancy was short, often only 30 to 40 years, with many infants not surviving childhood at all. The physical environment would also work against you. The sun is relentless in Greece, and sunscreen does not exist. After only a few hours outdoors, your skin might be burned raw. Shade was a luxury, and most people worked in the fields or on construction sites. their bodies hardened by years of labor. You, however, with your modern comfort and lack of training, would struggle to keep up. Even walking down the streets could be dangerous. There were no police in the modern sense. Athens had public slaves, known as Scythian archers, to keep order, but crime was still common. Thieves, brawls, and drunken arguments filled the streets, and you would be a very easy target. Your strange clothing, accent, and behavior would mark you as foreign immediately, and foreigners were often viewed with suspicion or outright hostility. Then there is the medical reality. Get a small cut on your foot from walking barefoot or in crude sandals? In our world, you could disinfect it with alcohol and cover it with a bandage. In ancient Greece, that cut might fester. Doctors did exist, like the famous Hippocrates, but their understanding of disease was limited. Illness was believed to be caused by imbalances of bodily humors or the will of the gods. Treatments included bloodletting, herbal concoctions, or prayers to Apollo. There were no antibiotics, no painkillers, no hospitals as we know them. Even something as simple as a toothache could become unbearable. Infections could kill you in days. Culturally, you would also feel out of place. The Greek world was built on slavery. In Athens, perhaps 1 in 3 people was enslaved. Slaves cooked meals, cleaned houses, taught children, and labored in the fields and mines. They had no rights and could be beaten or sold at will. To a modern person raised on ideas of freedom and human rights, this casual acceptance of slavery would be jarring. Yet in Greece, it was as natural as breathing. If you were unlucky enough to be mistaken for a slave, your day might not last very long at all. Finally, there is the overwhelming fact of time itself. You are in a world without electricity, without plumbing, without medicine, without equality, without comfort. Yes, this is the land that gave us democracy, theater, philosophy, and mathematics. But those achievements were built on the backs of suffering, inequality, and hardship. For the average person, daily survival was a struggle. For you, suddenly dropped into this world, unprepared, without all eyes or knowledge of the language, it would be nearly impossible. The weight of hunger, heat, illness, and social restrictions would close in quickly. The dream of seeing the glory that was Greece would vanish, replaced by the harsh reality of living in it. By the time the sun set on that first day, you would likely already be wishing for home. And the cruel truth is, you might not even survive to see the next sunrise. If you thought breakfast in modern times was sometimes disappointing, imagine waking up in ancient Greece to discover what people ate at the start of their day. Forget about bacon, eggs, toast, coffee, or even cereal. Instead, you would likely be offered a small piece of coarse barley bread, hard and dry, perhaps softened by dipping it into watered-down wine. Yes, wine in the morning. Not because Greeks wanted to start their day tipsy, but because water was often unreliable and unsafe to drink. Wine mixed with water was thought to purify it, reducing sickness. Coffee, tea, or anything resembling a hot drink simply did not exist. Chocolate, sugar, and potatoes were thousands of miles and centuries away from reaching Europe. Your breakfast of champions was a stale crust of bread and a mouthful of sour wine. Try getting through your morning commute, or in this case, a long day of farming or hard labor with that in your stomach. Barley was the cornerstone of the Greek diet. Wheat, though prized, was harder to grow in the rocky Greek soil and more expensive, so most families relied on barley bread, barley porridge, and barley cakes. Unfortunately, barley bread was not the fluffy loaf we imagine today. It was dense, gritty, and could break your teeth if it was baked poorly. Some historians have even found that fragments of ancient bread contained tiny particles of stone from grinding mills, which slowly wore down people's teeth, leaving them cracked, painful, and vulnerable to infection. So even the simple act of chewing your daily bread carried risks for your health. Lunch and dinner were not much more exciting. A midday meal might be another round of bread, perhaps accompanied by olives, figs, or cheese if you were fortunate. Fish was the main source of protein for many Greeks, though it was not always plentiful. Fresh fish was prized, but expensive unless you lived near the sea. More often, people ate dried or salted fish, preserved with care, so it would not spoil in the relentless Mediterranean heat. For the poor, meat was almost unheard of. Only during religious festivals would ordinary people taste lamb, goat, or pork, often after the animal had been sacrificed to the gods. The wealthy, on the other hand, could occasionally enjoy more varied meats, like beef or venison, but these luxuries were far out of reach for the common citizen. Fruits and vegetables, of course, were a regular part of the diet. Grapes were eaten fresh, dried into raisins, or pressed into wine. Figs were considered a staple, not only sweet, but also filling. Vegetables such as onions, garlic, cabbage, and cucumbers made frequent appearances at the table. These foods might sound healthy to us today, but keep in mind that the Greeks lacked seasoning variety. Salt was valuable and not always available, while spices from the East were far too expensive for the average household. Meals were often bland, repetitive, and uninspired. Imagine eating barley, figs, and a few olives for weeks on end. What might strike you as a refreshing Mediterranean snack today would quickly feel monotonous, even soul-crushing, when it became your only option. And then there was hunger. Despite the romantic image of Greece as a land of plenty, food security was always precarious. Crop failures, poor harvests, and warfare could leave entire populations hungry. A bad season meant rationing bread, stretching thin supplies, and watching your children cry for food you could not provide. Famine was not constant, but it loomed in the background of Greek life. In Sparta, boys were even encouraged to steal food as part of their training, not because it was a fun challenge, but because hunger was so common that stealing became a necessary skill. The cruel twist? If you were caught stealing, the punishment was severe, not for the theft itself, but for being careless enough to get caught. Water, the most basic necessity, was another problem. Wells and fountains existed, but the water was not always clean. Without modern filtration, diseases spread easily. Dysentery, parasites, and other illnesses were common. As a result, Greeks of all classes relied heavily on diluted wine. For them, it was safer than water. For you, a modern traveler, the taste would be strange and disappointing. Wine was not the sweet, carefully crafted drink we know today. It was often sour, rough, and mixed with water in ratios that left little pleasure. Imagine spending every day drinking something that tasted like watered-down vinegar, and don't expect sweet treats to comfort you. Sugar was unknown in ancient Greece. Honey was the only sweetener, and while it was treasured, it was not used lavishly. Honey cakes, sweetened wine, or fruit with honey were considered special, not everyday indulgences. For most people, dessert simply did not exist. Even milk was not regularly consumed as a drink. Instead, it was turned into cheese, which could last longer and serve as a more reliable source of protein. Dairy products existed, but in limited, practical forms. Forget your modern image of yogurt with honey and nuts for breakfast. While the Greeks did have a form of fermented milk similar to yogurt, it was tangy, lumpy, and not something you would look forward to. If you were a child in ancient Greece, your diet might be even more limited. Infants were often breastfed for longer than today, but once weaned, they faced the same plain foods as adults. Malnutrition was widespread, and infant mortality was heartbreakingly high. A child's chances of surviving beyond the age of 5 were slim, and if you were sickly, frail, or disabled, society offered little sympathy. Life was unforgiving, and food shortages only made it harsher. For the wealthy elite, dining looked very different. Banquets, known as symposia, were occasions for indulgence. Reclining on couches, men, always men, ate roasted meats, fine breads, honeyed pastries, and drank stronger, finer wines. But even these meals were not what you might imagine from movies. The food was simple compared to modern banquets, and women were rarely invited unless they were entertainers or servants. For most Greeks, the luxury of such meals was a distant dream. Your reality as an average person would be chewing through another tough barley loaf, with maybe a few olives to ease the dryness. One might think the Mediterranean climate, with its fertile valleys and sunny skies, would have made food abundant. But in truth, farming was difficult. Much of Greece's land is rocky, with thin soil that erodes easily. Farmers worked tirelessly to grow barley, grapes, and olives, the so-called Mediterranean triad. Goats and sheep grazed on hillsides, providing milk and occasional meat, but raising cattle was rare. Farmers used wooden plows pulled by oxen, a far cry from the mechanized farming we rely on today. A single bad season, too much rain, too little rain, or an invasion by locusts could devastate the food supply. With no modern storage systems, even small disruptions could turn into crises. So, while today's tourists in Greece might marvel at the olive groves, sip fine wines, and enjoy grilled seafood by the sea, the daily diet of the ancient Greeks was harsh, repetitive, and often insufficient. For you, used to supermarkets with endless variety and refrigerators keeping food fresh, the adjustment would be nearly impossible. Hunger would gnaw at your belly before the day was even half over. By the time the sun set, your body would feel weak, your stomach empty, and your mind dulled by the endless repetition of bread, olives, and figs. And you would realize, painfully, that the ancient Greek diet was not a lifestyle choice, but a matter of survival, and one that many people lost. Now let's talk about daily life and work. If you were suddenly transported to ancient Greece, the first thing you would realize is that life was not organized around leisure, but survival and obligation. The romantic picture of marble temples, philosophers in flowing robes, and Olympic athletes is just a tiny slice of reality. The truth is that most Greeks, especially the poor, spent their days laboring from sunrise to sunset, with little time for rest, pleasure, or personal freedom. For men, daily life was largely determined by class and occupation. The vast majority were farmers, since Greece's rocky landscape demanded constant work just to coax food from the soil. If you were a farmer, your mornings began before the sun rose. You would walk into the fields with a wooden plow, guiding oxen slowly over the dry earth. Your tools were simple and unforgiving, and progress was painstakingly slow. Planting barley, olives, and grapes was backbreaking work, and the fear of drought or flood haunted every season. Unlike today, there were no machines to make the work easier, no pesticides to protect crops, and no fertilizers beyond animal manure. If the harvest failed, your family's survival was directly at risk. If you lived in a city like Athens, your work might look different, but no less demanding. Artisans filled the narrow streets, hammering bronze, carving marble, or shaping clay into pots. The potter's wheel spun endlessly, producing the vessels that stored oil, wine, and grain. Blacksmiths bent over smoky forges, sweat pouring down their faces as they hammered iron into tools or weapons. These workshops were noisy, dirty, and often dangerous. Burns, cuts, and accidents were common, and there was no concept of workplace safety. For you, as a visitor from the modern world, the constant dust, smoke, and grime would quickly become unbearable. Women's daily lives followed a very different rhythm. For most women, especially in Athens, the home was the center of existence. Daily chores consumed every hour: grinding grain, baking bread, weaving cloth, tending children, fetching water, cleaning the house, and preparing meals. Imagine carrying heavy jars of water from a public fountain every day because there was no plumbing in your house. Imagine weaving endlessly because every garment your family wore had to be made by hand on a loom. Clothes did not come from markets or shops. They came from the unceasing labor of women, who were expected to produce cloth for the entire household. For an Athenian woman, stepping outside without permission was frowned upon. She lived a life of seclusion and obedience, her world defined by walls of her home. In contrast, Spartan women had far more freedom. They managed estates, trained physically, and could even own property. But before you envy them, remember that this freedom came at a cost. Spartan society was centered on warfare, and men were constantly away in military training or battle. Women were expected to maintain the household economy, while also producing strong, healthy children to serve the state. Marriage in Sparta was less about romance and more about supplying future soldiers. So even in this unusual case of female freedom, life was harsh and filled with pressure. Children, too, had a very different experience than today. In Athens, boys were educated if the family could afford it, learning reading, writing, arithmetic, music, and gymnastics. But education was not universal. Poor children were more likely to be put to work early. Girls, on the other hand, rarely received formal schooling. They learned domestic skills at home, preparing for a life of managing households. In Sparta, children faced an even grimmer reality. At the age of 7, boys were taken from their families to live in military barracks, where they were subjected to rigorous training, discipline, and hardship. They learned to endure pain, hunger, and exhaustion, preparing to become warriors of the state. Childhood in Sparta was not about play, it was about survival and indoctrination. Slavery formed another dark foundation of Greek daily life. Slaves were everywhere, working in homes, fields, mines, and workshops. Some were prisoners of war, others were born into slavery, and many were bought and sold like livestock. They performed the hardest and most dangerous labor, especially in silver mines, where they worked in suffocating tunnels under brutal conditions. Death in the mines was common, and freedom was almost impossible. For you, the sight of human beings treated as property would be shocking and unbearable, but for the Greeks, it was simply the structure of society. Athenian democracy, often celebrated as the birthplace of freedom, relied heavily on the labor of slaves who had no rights at all. Even leisure looked very different from what you know. Today, after work, you might scroll on your phone, watch TV, or relax with friends. In ancient Greece, leisure was mostly the privilege of men, and even then, it took on structured forms. In Athens, men gathered at the agora, the marketplace, not just to shop, but to debate politics, exchange ideas, or listen to philosophers. This was not idle chit-chat, it was civic duty. For men of higher status, evenings might be spent at a symposium, reclining on couches, drinking diluted wine, and engaging in discussions, music, or games. But these events excluded women, except as entertainers. For the poor, leisure simply meant a brief rest after endless labor, with no couches, no luxuries, and no escape from exhaustion. Religious duties also shaped daily life. Festivals honoring the gods punctuated the year, offering a rare break from routine. These events included processions, sacrifices, athletic competitions, and dramatic performances. They were communal occasions that brought people together, but they also reinforced the dominance of religion in everyday thinking. Sacrificing animals, burning incense, and offering prayers were not optional. They were central to life. Imagine living in a world where every action, from planting crops to sailing a ship, required the blessing of a god. Ultimately, what would make daily life and work in ancient Greece unbearable for you is the sheer relentlessness of it all. From sunrise to sunset, people labored without modern conveniences, without security, and without the comforts you take for granted. There were no weekends, no vacations, no guarantees. Illness, accident, or famine could strike at any moment, leaving you powerless. While the stories of philosophers and heroes fill the pages of history, the reality for most Greeks was toil, repetition, and survival. Let's shift our attention for a moment to something that shaped every Greek life, rich or poor: food. After all, no matter how grand your temples or how poetic your tragedies, you still had to eat. And eating in ancient Greece was not always as glamorous as the stories of banquets and feasts might suggest. For the average Greek, meals were simple, repetitive, and, depending on the season, sometimes scarce. Bread formed the heart of the Greek diet, but not the soft, fluffy loaves we're used to today. Instead, imagine dense, dark bread made from barley, often coarse and heavy. Barley was cheaper and more reliable than wheat, so it was the staple food for most people. Wheat bread was considered a luxury, lighter, tastier, and something that only wealthier households could afford regularly. Archaeologists have even uncovered charred remnants of bread from ancient ovens, giving us a glimpse of these meals preserved through fire and time. Meals were small and functional. Breakfast might be nothing more than barley bread dipped in watered-down wine, essentially a kind of poor man's cereal. Lunch was usually just leftovers or something equally light. The main meal of the day, taken in the evening, might include bread, olives, figs, onions, and maybe some cheese if you were fortunate. Meat was rarely on the table for ordinary citizens. It was expensive and usually tied to religious rituals. If you ate meat, it was likely from a sacrificial animal offered at a temple, divided among worshippers after the ceremony. In this way, religion and diet were closely intertwined. Olive oil was everywhere. It wasn't just a cooking ingredient. It was fuel for lamps, a base for perfumes, and a moisturizer for the skin. Whole amphorae of olive oil were traded across the Mediterranean, and olive trees themselves were considered sacred. Cutting one down in Athens could even bring the death penalty. The olive truly was life in Greece. Wine also played a central role, but don't picture fine bottles aged in cellars. Greek wine was strong, often sour, and always mixed with water. Drinking undiluted wine was seen as barbaric, the kind of thing only uncivilized people or drunkards did. At elite gatherings, called symposiums, wine was carefully prepared and rationed, mixed with water in large bowls. These symposiums were more than just drinking parties. They were cultural hubs where men reclined on couches, debated philosophy, recited poetry, or simply tried to outwit each other in conversation. But such pleasures were restricted to the wealthy. Commoners drank their watered wine quietly at home, if they had it at all. Now, while we imagine Greeks surrounded by olives, grapes, and fish, reality was not so plentiful. Food shortages were common, especially in cities like Athens that relied on imported grain. A bad harvest or a disrupted trade route could send prices skyrocketing. Ancient records describe times when bread became so expensive that the poor went hungry. Famines occasionally struck, and when they did, survival meant stretching meals to the bare minimum. Wild greens, lentils, or whatever could be foraged. And here's where the differences between city-states become clear. In Sparta, meals were intentionally austere. Spartan boys were fed just enough to survive, the idea being that constant hunger would make them tough and resourceful. The infamous Spartan black broth, a mixture of pork boiled with blood, vinegar, and salt, was a source of pride for them, though outsiders often found it disgusting. One story tells of a visiting Athenian who tried the broth and remarked that he now understood why. Spartans were so fearless in battle. Death is preferable to another meal of this. Contrast that with Athens, where wealthier citizens could indulge in delicacies. Fish and seafood were highly prized, especially in coastal cities, and markets sold everything from tuna to squid. Honey was the main sweetener, used in cakes and desserts, and herbs like thyme, oregano, and mint flavored their simple dishes. Still, this was a privilege of those with money. For the majority, diet remained repetitive, and hunger was a constant companion. Food was also tied to gender. Women were expected to prepare meals, but often had little say in what was eaten. especially in wealthier homes where slaves might do the cooking. In symposiums, women were excluded entirely unless they were entertainers or courtesans. The act of sharing food, therefore, reinforced social boundaries: who ate, what they ate, and with whom told you exactly where you stood in the hierarchy of Greek life. Religion shaped food in other ways too. Festivals were often centered on communal meals. Sacrifices meant that whole communities could share in the meat of an ox or goat, feasting together after honoring the gods. But fasts also existed, where worshippers refrained from certain foods to purify themselves before rituals. To eat was never just to eat. It was tied to survival, identity, and spirituality. Even children's diets reflected these realities. In wealthier homes, boys might be raised on milk, bread, and honey, but in poorer households, malnutrition was common. Bones discovered from ancient burial sites sometimes show stunted growth or signs of anemia, physical reminders of the fragility of survival. Food was never guaranteed. To live in ancient Greece was to live with the awareness that a single bad harvest could change everything. So while our modern image of Greek feasts comes from painted pottery showing reclining men with cups of wine, the truth was more complicated. Most Greeks would never see such abundance. Their reality was a bowl of lentils, a piece of barley bread, maybe a drizzle of olive oil if they were lucky, and always the uncertainty of tomorrow's meal. All right, let us take a step away from the noisy marketplaces and dusty battlefields and walk into the place everyone called their own, the Greek home. Daily life wasn't just about politics, war, and philosophy. It was also about how people lived behind closed doors, who they shared their space with, and what those spaces looked like. The first thing that might surprise you is how modest most Greek houses were. Forget marble palaces with gilded doors. The majority of citizens lived in small, practical dwellings made of sun-dried mud brick. These walls, though cheap and easy to build, didn't last long. Rain could wash them down, and time eventually wore them away. That is one reason so little remains of ordinary homes today. They simply crumbled back into the earth. Roofs were typically made of clay tiles or thatched reeds, and floors were just packed earth. Wealthier citizens, however, might enjoy stone foundations, mosaic floors, or even painted walls, though that was rare outside the elite. A typical house had only a handful of rooms arranged around a central courtyard. This courtyard wasn't just decorative, it was the heart of the home. Here, families cooked, worked, and socialized. Without modern stoves or chimneys, open-air spaces made it easier to handle fire, smoke, and the heat of daily cooking. Wells sometimes provided water, though many still had to fetch it from public fountains. Greek homes were also divided by gender. Men and women lived under the same roof, of course, but their roles and spaces were separated. The men's area, often called the andron, was where male guests were entertained, especially during symposiums. This room was usually decorated more richly than the rest of the house, with couches set around the walls and drinking vessels carefully displayed. Women, on the other hand, were mostly confined to the gyneconitis, a separate area where they wove, raised children, and managed household tasks. Respectable women rarely mingled with male guests, and their lives were kept deliberately private. Marriage in ancient Greece was practical rather than romantic. Girls married young, often in their early teens, to much older men chosen by their fathers. Love was not the foundation. Stability, property, and family alliances were. Once married, a woman's role was clear: manage the household, bear children, and ensure the continuity of the family line. Large families were common ideals, but high infant mortality rates meant many children never lived to adulthood. Women who failed to produce sons could face scorn or even replacement through divorce. Children's lives varied depending on gender. Boys were raised to become citizens, soldiers, or craftsmen, while girls were prepared for domestic life. Toys have been found, dolls, rattles, and balls, suggesting children did have time to play. But play was short-lived. Athenian boys, around age 7, were sent to school if their families could afford it, where they learned reading, writing, music, and gymnastics. Girls, on the other hand, stayed home, learning weaving, cooking, and household management from their mothers. In Sparta, as always, things were different. Boys were taken from their families at age 7 and placed in harsh military training, while Spartan girls were encouraged to exercise and grow strong, supposedly to bear healthier warriors. Slavery was woven deeply into this domestic world. Nearly every household, even modest ones, owned slaves. They performed much of the labor, grinding grain, fetching water, cleaning, or even tutoring children if they were educated. Slaves were considered property, with no rights of their own, and could be bought, sold, or punished at their owner's will. Some were captured in wars, others were born into slavery, and a few could buy or earn their freedom. But for most, life meant endless work with little hope of change. Privacy, as we know it today, didn't really exist. Families lived closely together, often sharing single rooms for sleeping. Courtyards were open to the sounds and sights of neighbors, and thin walls offered little separation. Bathing was usually done at public baths, where men gathered not just to wash, but to socialize and exchange gossip. For women, bathing was more private, often at home with water, carried in jars and heated over a fire. Religion touched the household deeply. Small shrines, called herms, often stood in courtyards or at doorways, dedicated to protective gods like Hermes or Hestia. Families would offer simple sacrifices, bread, wine, or a bit of incense to guard their homes. Births, marriages, and deaths were all tied to rituals that took place inside the home as much as in temples. The line between sacred and ordinary was thin. Every meal or moment of family life was believed to be watched over by the gods. Domestic life also reflected wealth. A rich Athenian might dine reclining on couches, his meals served by slaves in decorated pottery, while his wife managed a household staff. A poor farmer, by contrast, might live in a one-room hut with a dirt floor, eating the same barley porridge every day, working from dawn until dusk. The gap between rich and poor was visible not only in politics and power, but in the very walls people slept under. Yet for all these differences, family life gave Greeks a sense of belonging. In a world where war, famine, and disease could strike suddenly, the household was a place of continuity. Children honored their parents, wives supported their husbands, and religious rituals bound them together. Even in the smallest mud brick home, the courtyard filled with the smell of bread baking. The sound of a loom and the laughter of children playing gave meaning to daily existence. So, while the grand temples and statues might capture our imagination today, the true rhythm of ancient Greece beat quietly inside these modest homes, where families lived, worked, and worshipped together. And for most Greeks, it was this private world, more than politics or philosophy, that shaped their lives day to day. If you want to know what it was really like to live in ancient Greece, you cannot ignore the everyday struggle with hygiene. Forget the comforts of running water, hot showers, and toothpaste. A Greek's experience of staying clean and managing daily sanitation was a world apart, shaped by resourcefulness, ritual, and the limits of their environment. Bathing was one of the cornerstones of Greek hygiene, but not in the way we picture today. Soap as we know it did not exist. Instead, Greeks used olive oil as both a moisturizer and a cleansing agent. They would smear oil across their skin, then scrape it off with a curved metal tool called a strigil. The scraping removed sweat, dust, and grime. And though it left a sheen of oil, the method was considered refreshing and practical. In gymnasiums, this practice was so common that jars of oil and strigils were as important as the weights and discus. For athletes, oiling and scraping after exercise was not just about cleanliness, but also ritual purification. Public baths existed in larger cities, but they were not the luxurious, steaming bathhouses the Romans later built. Greek baths were often simple basins or communal pools of cool water. Heating water required cutting and burning precious firewood, so hot baths were more of a luxury. Most people relied on oil scraping and quick rinses from fountains or basins at home. For the poor, even that could be rare. Washing hands and face at a fountain often had to suffice. Barbershops served as another center of hygiene. Men went not only for haircuts and beard trims, but also for small grooming rituals. Barbers might pluck stray hairs, scrub off dead skin with pumice, or apply perfumed oils. These shops doubled as social hubs, where news, gossip, and politics mixed freely with grooming. Women who did not frequent barbers often relied on family members or hired attendants to manage hair, nails, and skin. They used pumice to smooth calluses, ash pastes to lighten skin, and heavy perfumes to cover smells of smoke, sweat, and cooking. Perfume was a constant in Greek life. With smoke from hearths and the crowded conditions of city homes, odors built up quickly. Fragrances made from myrrh, rose, cinnamon, or sage were applied to skin, clothing, and even woven into garlands. They served both practical and symbolic purposes, covering unpleasant smells, but also marking status and refinement. Religious rituals also demanded purification with scents and oils, reinforcing the idea that smelling pleasant was a kind of moral duty. Water supply and waste management were where the Greeks' ingenuity and limitations collided. Cities like Athens built elaborate fountain houses, where citizens fetched water daily in clay jars. Wealthier homes might have private cisterns, but most relied on public fountains. Drains channeled waste and rainwater into the streets, but there was no true sewer system like in later Roman cities. Instead, waste mixed with runoff, creating foul-smelling alleys. Keeping a home tolerable required sweeping courtyards, sprinkling herbs, and relying on airflow. Toilets, too, were a mix of practicality and discomfort. Wealthy homes sometimes had rudimentary latrines, but most households used clay chamber pots. These were emptied into cesspits, compost heaps, or tossed outside city walls. Public toilets existed in some places, with stone benches over running water, but they were communal and lacked privacy. Toilet paper did not exist. Instead, people used wool scraps if they could afford them, or more commonly smooth stones and broken pieces of pottery called pessoi. Archaeologists have uncovered these near latrines, scratched smooth by repeated use, a vivid reminder of the realities of ancient sanitation. Laundry was a laborious process. Professional fullers handled most clothing, especially wool garments. They washed clothes with alkaline substances like clay or ash, beating and trampling the cloth in vats to clean and tighten the fibers. Fullers sometimes even used human urine as a cleansing agent because of its ammonia content, a practice the Romans would later perfect. Ordinary households without access to fullers had to wash garments in basins, scrubbing with sand or ash, wringing them out, and drying them under the sun. Linen tunics and bedding at least were easier to wash than heavy wool cloaks, but it still took effort. Dental care was another hidden struggle. Greeks did not have toothbrushes, but they chewed aromatic resins like mastic, which both freshened breath and exercised the gums. Some used tooth powders made of charcoal, bone dust, or crushed shells, which cleaned but also eroded enamel. Combined with gritty bread made from stone-ground flour, which often carried fragments of sand, teeth wore down quickly. Toothaches and abscesses were common, and remedies were limited to herbal poultices or extraction. Parasites were everywhere. Fleas and lice thrived in beds and clothing. Combs were used daily to pick out lice, and beds were beaten outside to shake out insects. Some burned aromatic herbs to fumigate rooms, hoping to drive pests away. Wealthier families layered their bedding with linen sheets, which could be laundered more often, but poorer families often had to accept the constant nuisance. All of this meant that staying clean in ancient Greece required constant maintenance. Fetching water, emptying pots, scraping skin, combing out lice, stomping clothes, dabbing perfume, all were daily tasks. For the Greeks, this was simply normal life, woven into their routines and rituals. But for someone transported from the modern world, the sheer effort and discomfort of ancient hygiene would feel exhausting and overwhelming. Surviving even a single day would mean scraping oil from your skin with a strigil, crouching over a chamber pot, and picking lice out of your hair by lamplight. For us, that sounds unpleasant at best, intolerable at worst. For them, it was just life, endured with resilience and even pride in the rituals that defined their civilization. So far, we've explored food, politics, and even the daily grind. But let's step back for a moment and ask, what did the Greeks actually do for fun? Because no matter how harsh life was, people have always craved moments of leisure, art, and play. And in ancient Greece, entertainment wasn't just about passing the time. It was tightly woven into culture, religion, and even politics. The first thing you might picture when thinking of Greek entertainment is the theater. Athens in particular was the birthplace of drama, and plays weren't just a pastime. They were civic events. Imagine standing among thousands of spectators in the great theater of Dionysus, carved into the hillside below the Acropolis. The air hums with anticipation as actors, masked and robed, take the stage to perform tragedies by Sophocles or Euripides, or comedies by Aristophanes. These weren't light shows. Tragedies explored deep themes of fate, morality, and human suffering, while comedies often poked fun at politicians, philosophers, and everyday Athenian life. Attending wasn't optional either. It was part of one's civic and religious duty, funded by the city and dedicated to Dionysus, the god of wine and festivity. But theater wasn't the only show in town. Music and poetry played a central role in Greek leisure. The lyre, a small harp-like instrument, accompanied singers, while flutes added sharp, lively notes to celebrations. Poetry wasn't just written down to be read silently. It was performed. Think of epic poems like Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. These were recited aloud, often over multiple evenings, with rhythm and performance keeping audiences engaged. Even private gatherings featured music, with skilled performers called all-away players, adding atmosphere to symposiums. Speaking of symposiums, they deserve their own spotlight. Picture an evening gathering of men reclining on couches, sipping watered wine, and discussing philosophy, politics, or poetry. It wasn't just about drinking, though there was plenty of that, but about debate, storytelling, and bonding. Games might break out, like kotabos, where players flicked wine dregs at a target. Musicians and dancers entertained, and sometimes the evening blurred the line between intellectual conversation and wild revelry. For the wealthy, symposiums were a mark of status. For philosophers, they became fertile ground for ideas that shaped Western thought. Of course, entertainment wasn't limited to the elite. Ordinary people enjoyed more down-to-earth pastimes. Board games, dice, and knuckle-bones, an early version of jacks, played with animal bones, were popular, especially among children. Marketplaces provided not just goods, but also music, juggling, and storytelling. Religious festivals were some of the biggest sources of amusement for everyone, rich or poor. Take the Panathenaea in Athens, a massive celebration with parades, sacrifices, athletic competitions, and music contests. These festivals mixed devotion to the gods with sheer human enjoyment, blending sacred and social in a way that defined Greek culture. And we can't talk about Greek leisure without mentioning athletics. Sports weren't just exercise. They were almost a religion in themselves, tied to ideals of physical perfection and honor. The Olympic Games, held every 4 years at Olympia, brought athletes from across the Greek world to compete in running, wrestling, discus, javelin, and chariot racing. Victorious athletes became local heroes, immortalized in statues and poems. But these games weren't just about glory. They were also about the gods, particularly Zeus, to whom the games were dedicated. Even outside the Olympics, sports filled Greek life. Every city had its own games, gymnasiums, and training grounds. Boys were expected to train their bodies as well as their minds, reflecting the Greek ideal of balance. Wrestling matches, foot races, and pankration, a brutal mix of boxing and wrestling, drew crowds eager to cheer, gamble, and marvel at human strength. Spectator sports created a sense of unity and identity, much like soccer or basketball today. Art also played a role in leisure, though it wasn't art for art's sake in the way we think of it now. Sculpture, pottery, and painting had practical and religious functions. Pottery, for example, decorated with mythological scenes or everyday life, was both useful and beautiful. Statues honored gods, athletes, and civic leaders. For wealthy Greeks, commissioning. Art was both a way of giving thanks to the gods and showing off one's taste and status. And don't forget about dance. From solemn religious processions to lively festival performances, dance was everywhere. It wasn't seen as frivolous, but as a form of devotion and cultural expression. Women, often excluded from other public forms of entertainment, could participate in dances linked to rituals and festivals. Some dances were slow and ceremonial. Others were wild and energetic, meant to channel joy, passion, or even madness in honor of Dionysus. Leisure also meant enjoying the natural world. Greeks took walks in the agora, marketplace, relaxed in public baths, though these were less elaborate than Roman ones, and visited sanctuaries not only for worship, but for the sense of beauty and peace they offered. Hunting and fishing were both work and recreation, especially for the wealthy, who could afford the time and equipment. Yet it's important to remember, leisure in Greece wasn't equally shared. Men had far more access to public entertainment than women, who were largely confined to the home. Slaves, who made up a large part of the population, didn't enjoy leisure in the same way, though some might find small moments of amusement in festivals or family gatherings. Entertainment reflected the hierarchies of Greek society, just as much as it reflected its creativity. If you were dropped into an ancient Greek city during a festival, you'd probably be swept up in a blur of music, dancing, feasting, and games. The streets would echo with laughter, chants, and the clamor of contests. You might watch a tragic play that leaves you questioning fate itself, then cheer at a wrestling match where dust and sweat filled the air. And later that evening, if you were lucky enough to be invited to a symposium, you'd recline on a couch, cup of wine in hand, listening to philosophers debate the meaning of justice. But just as likely, if you were a common farmer or servant, your entertainment would be simpler. A small dice game with friends, a tune hummed by a flute player in the market, or the joy of watching your child master a game of knucklebones. No matter the class, Greeks carved out spaces for joy, creativity, and togetherness, proving that even in a world of hard labor and harsh realities, humans have always needed art and play to make life worth living. When trying to imagine life in ancient Greece, it's impossible to ignore one of its most defining features: the constant shadow of war. For the Greeks, conflict was not an occasional tragedy, but a persistent rhythm of existence. City-states like Athens, Sparta, Corinth, and Thebes lived in uneasy balance, bound together by shared language and religion, but divided by politics and ambition. Every man knew that one day he might be called to fight, not as a professional soldier, but as a citizen compelled to defend his polis. The Greek soldier was known as the hoplite, and the hoplite system reveals much about the brutal demands of this world. To serve as a hoplite meant owning enough land to afford the heavy armor, a bronze helmet, breastplate, greaves, a large round shield called a hoplon, and a spear about 8 feet long. This was no small expense. Poorer citizens who could not afford the panoply often served as light armed troops, throwing stones, javelins, or shooting arrows from the fringes. The very structure of the army reflected the inequalities of society, as wealthier citizens stood in the front ranks, while the poor risked their lives in less protected roles. Training for war began young. In Sparta, this was most extreme. Boys were taken at age 7 into the agoge, the state's brutal education system. There they were hardened through beatings, hunger, and ceaseless drills, molded into warriors who placed obedience and endurance above all else. While Athens did not practice such severity, its young men too were expected to train in athletics and weapons handling. The gymnasium was not merely for fitness, it was preparation for the battlefield. When a man turned 18 in Athens, he began 2 years of military service as an epheb, learning to guard the borders and handle arms. But what did battle itself look like? The hallmark of Greek warfare was the phalanx, a dense formation of hoplites standing shoulder to shoulder, shields locked, spears bristling outward like a wall of iron and bronze. The strength of the phalanx came from discipline and unity. Each man's shield protected the soldier to his left. To falter was not just cowardice, but betrayal. The clash of two phalanxes was terrifying. Lines of armored men pushing against each other, spears jabbing, shields slamming, the ground turning slick with mud and blood. Victory often depended not on skill, but on sheer endurance, which is why the strongest, wealthiest, and most drilled armies tended to dominate. Yet the horrors of war did not end when the battle was won. Casualties were immense, wounds often fatal, and medical care was rudimentary. Broken bones, spear thrusts, or arrows often led to infection. Doctors might try poultices of herbs or cauterization with heated metal, but survival depended more on luck than science. Those who returned home carried scars, both visible and invisible. Plays like those of Sophocles reveal the lingering trauma of war, hinting at what we would now call post-traumatic stress. War also meant profound disruption for daily life. When men marched to fight, fields were left untended, families vulnerable. Enemies would burn crops, cut down olive groves, and poison wells to starve their rivals into submission. During the Peloponnesian War, Athens watched helplessly as Spartan armies ravaged its farmlands year after year. Refugees crowded into city walls, creating filth and disease. The famous plague of 430 BCE, which killed tens of thousands including Pericles himself, spread in part because of this overcrowding. The cultural weight of war was immense. In Sparta, military service was life's purpose. But even in Athens, where art and philosophy flourished, victory in war was celebrated with monuments, festivals, and plays. Tombs of the fallen were placed in public view, and their names etched into stone as eternal reminders of sacrifice. Cowards, by contrast, were disgraced. To be branded as one who dropped his shield and fled was a lifelong stain. Honor and shame were not abstractions. They shaped how every Greek man measured his worth. For women, war brought its own burdens. While men fought, women had to manage farms, raise children, and survive in the face of famine or invasion. In some cities, women even endured capture and enslavement when their polis was defeated. The fate of conquered women, whether forced into slavery, concubinage, or displacement, was one of the cruelest realities of Greek warfare, often overlooked in heroic tales of hoplites and generals. Religious belief was interwoven with war. Before marching, armies sought omens through sacrifices, watching the entrails of animals for signs of divine favor. Soldiers prayed to Ares, god of war, or Athena, goddess of wisdom and battle. Victory was never seen as mere strategy. It was a gift from the gods. Losing, therefore, was not just a military failure, but a spiritual shame. And yet, despite the horror, war was romanticized in Greek culture. The Iliad, Homer's great epic, glorified the valor of Achilles and Hector, shaping ideals of heroism for centuries. Young men recited these lines, imagining themselves as warriors of old, even though real war was mud, sweat, and terror. Tragedians like Euripides pushed back against this glorification, showing the suffering of women and children, the futility of endless bloodshed, and the gods' indifference. Still, the cycle continued, generation after generation, until Alexander the Great turned the Greek world into an empire through conquest. For us today, accustomed to armies of professionals and distant wars fought by a small percentage of society, the Greek reality would be shocking. Every man was a soldier first, citizen second, farmer or craftsman third. To last even a day in this environment meant carrying armor that weighed over 70 pounds, standing shoulder to shoulder in a suffocating phalanx, praying the man beside you would not falter. It meant watching your crops burn, your family suffer, and your polis gamble lives for honor. This constant readiness for war was not a part-time duty. It was the backbone of Greek identity. To survive, it would require not only physical strength, but also the psychological resilience to accept that war was not the exception, but the rule of life. For modern people dropped into ancient Greece, this burden alone would make lasting even a single day nearly impossible. When people today picture the gods of ancient Greece, they often imagine marble statues, heroic myths, or the Olympians lounging on Mount Olympus. But for the Greeks themselves, religion was not some abstract system of belief. It was a daily obligation, an endless cycle of rituals and sacrifices that governed every part of life. To live in ancient Greece was to live under the constant gaze of the divine, and the expectations of the gods were heavy, relentless, and at times brutally impossible. Unlike many modern religions that emphasize personal faith, Greek religion was transactional. The relationship with the gods worked through do ut day. I give so that you may give. A farmer sacrificed a goat in hopes of a good harvest. A sailor poured wine into the sea for safe passage. A city slaughtered hundreds of bulls before battle to win divine favor. To fail in these duties was not simply bad manners. It was dangerous because neglecting the gods could bring disaster on an entire community. Imagine the weight of knowing that if you failed to burn the right incense or offered too few sacrifices, your neighbors might blame you for a storm, a famine, or a plague. Festivals filled the calendar, and each polis had its own variations, but all were demanding. In Athens, the Panathenæa honored Athena with days of processions, athletic contests, music, and feasts. This was not optional leisure. Citizens were expected to participate, and the cost of funding certain rituals often fell on wealthy individuals. These public duties, called liturgies, could bankrupt even the richest if fortune turned against them. To be chosen to fund a dramatic performance at the Dionysia, for example, was both a great honor and a crushing financial burden. For ordinary citizens, ritual sacrifice was the most common act of worship. Sacrifice was bloody, messy, and expensive. Animals had to be purchased, prepared, and slaughtered in precise ways. Priests examined the entrails for omens, and if they found something unfavorable, the whole process had to be repeated. Even participation carried strict rules. Women, slaves, and foreigners often had limited roles, and mistakes in the ritual could offend the gods rather than appease them. Imagine the anxiety standing in a crowd, the smoke of burning thigh bones curling skyward, knowing that one slip of protocol could ruin the entire offering. Religion also dictated personal conduct. Oaths were sacred, sworn by the gods, and breaking one was not just dishonorable, but spiritually dangerous. Purity laws governed who could enter a temple when a person was considered ritually clean, and how long one had to abstain from certain acts before approaching the divine. For instance, childbirth and death both rendered individuals polluted for a period of time, cutting them off from sacred spaces. Families had to observe strict mourning rituals for the dead, from laying out the body to leading funeral processions, and any deviation risked angering the chthonic gods of the underworld. Religion was not only personal, but deeply political. Wars were launched only after favorable omens, and treaties were sanctified with sacrifices. Priests and oracles wielded enormous influence, shaping decisions that affected entire nations. The most famous of these was the Oracle of Delphi, where the Pythia, a priestess of Apollo, delivered cryptic prophecies while inhaling vapors from a fissure in the earth. Her words could determine whether a city went to war, whether a king kept his throne, or whether a colony was founded across the sea. But her answers were deliberately ambiguous, and misinterpreting them could be disastrous. Think of King Croesus of Lydia, who was told that if he attacked Persia, a great empire would fall. Believing it meant victory, he went to war only to see his own empire destroyed. Beyond the great temples and oracles, religion saturated even the humblest moments. Before meals, libations were poured. At weddings, sacrifices and prayers sealed the union. Children were dedicated to gods at birth, and even athletes thanked the divine for their victories. In a world without modern science, every unexplained event, storms, illness, sudden death, was interpreted as the will of gods or spirits. Fear of offending them shaped behavior in ways we would find suffocating. One particularly striking feature of Greek religion was the emphasis on competition even in worship. Festivals involved not just prayers but contests, races, chariot driving, poetry recitals, and theatrical performances, all held in honor of gods. Failure in these competitions was not merely personal disappointment, but could be seen as divine disfavor. Imagine training for years, spending your family's fortune, and still losing in front of thousands, with everyone whispering that perhaps the gods had chosen to shame you. Religious obligation was heavy enough, but it also carried darker elements. The Greeks believed in curses and used curse tablets, thin sheets of lead inscribed with pleas for gods or spirits to harm rivals. These were buried in graves or wells to reach the underworld. Superstition ran deep, and people constantly sought protection from evil spirits with charms, amulets, and spells. Far from the serene image of classical temples, everyday Greek religion often involved fear, suspicion, and attempts to manipulate unseen forces. And then there was the ever-present idea of hubris, the sin of pride, of thinking oneself equal to the gods. Greek literature is full of stories where mortals who overstepped were punished horribly. Niobe, who boasted of her many children, saw them slaughtered by Apollo and Artemis. Arachne, who dared to challenge Athena in weaving, was transformed into a spider. These myths were not distant tales. They were moral warnings that hung over real lives. Every Greek knew that success could be dangerous, for the higher you rose, the more the gods might notice and cut you down. For someone from the modern world, where religion is often treated as private choice or occasional tradition, the sheer weight of Greek religious life would be overwhelming. It was not something you could set aside or ignore. It demanded constant offerings, constant rituals, constant attention to purity and propriety. To fail was to risk not only your own life, but the welfare of your entire community. This is why lasting even a single day in ancient Greece would be nearly impossible for us. Imagine waking at dawn, already worried about whether you had performed the proper libation, attending a festival that drained your wallet, listening to priests warn of divine wrath, all while fearing that one mistake, one unclean hand, one forgotten sacrifice might bring ruin. Religion was not comfort, but obligation, not freedom, but burden, and it bound every Greek in a web of duties that never loosened. As we reach the final chapter of this exploration into the daily struggles of ancient Greece, it becomes clear that life in that world was not the marble perfection we often imagine from statues and myths. Instead, it was a constant balancing act between survival, duty, and the overwhelming expectations of society, family, and gods. And for someone from today, dropped without warning into that society, Lasting even a single day would feel like being crushed under an invisible weight. Think about everything we have uncovered so far. From the very start of the day, you would be fighting discomfort. The houses were dark, smoky, and cramped, with no modern plumbing or conveniences. You would be forced to draw water from a well, light a smoky oil lamp, and endure the constant presence of insects and dust. Breakfast was no comforting feast, but barley bread or watery porridge, leaving you hungry for the long hours ahead. Even sleep would not have refreshed you much, since mattresses were straw-filled sacks and cold drafts seeped into every corner. Then came the grind of daily labor. Farming meant back-breaking work under the Mediterranean sun, often with primitive tools and little rest. City dwellers faced crowded workshops, noisy markets, and the constant pressure of civic obligations. Women bore the weight of domestic duties from dawn until night, grinding grain, weaving, hauling water, raising children with little recognition. Slaves endured the worst, stripped of autonomy and dignity. There was no off time, no sense of leisure as we understand it, only the cycles of work, ritual, and obligation repeating endlessly. Food was scarce and monotonous, built around bread, olives, and wine, with occasional fish or vegetables. Meat was rare, reserved for sacrifices or festivals, and dairy products were limited. Malnutrition, parasites, and food shortages were constant threats. And while modern kitchens allow us to enjoy variety and safety in our meals, ancient Greeks often ate meals tainted by smoke, spoiled storage, or unsafe preparation. Even something as simple as drinking water could be dangerous, since wells and cisterns easily became contaminated. Hygiene and health were other impossible challenges. With no understanding of germs, medicine relied on balancing humors through purging, bleeding, or herbal remedies that often did more harm than good. Doctors like Hippocrates recorded theories, but practical cures were unreliable. A minor infection could spiral into deadly sepsis. Childbirth was perilous, and epidemics regularly swept through communities. Bathing was rare, and while athletes oiled and scraped their bodies in gymnasiums, ordinary citizens endured grime and sweat daily. The very smell of life in an ancient Greek city would be overwhelming for us today. Animals, waste, smoke, sweat, and decay mingling in every alley. Religion offered no respite. In fact, it added another layer of pressure. Every action was shadowed by divine expectation libations poured before meals, sacrifices made before journeys, omens checked before decisions. Forget one ritual or break one purity rule, and misfortune was believed to strike. Entire communities could turn against individuals accused of angering the gods. Even festivals, which appear joyous in art and literature, were heavy with obligation and cost. Imagine being forced to fund a public ritual you could not afford, knowing that failure would bring shame not only from your neighbors, but also from the gods themselves. Society itself enforced harsh standards. Class divisions defined your opportunities, and citizenship was reserved for a narrow slice of the population. Women were excluded from politics, often confined to domestic spaces, and their lives were tightly controlled by male relatives. Slaves had no rights at all, serving as the backbone of Greek labor, but receiving none of its rewards. Foreigners could live and trade, but never fully belong. And even among male citizens, honor and reputation had to be defended constantly, sometimes through duels, lawsuits, or costly displays of generosity. The pressure to prove oneself never lifted. The cultural ideals of beauty and perfection added yet another burden. Men were expected to train their bodies endlessly in the gymnasium, striving for sculpted physiques that mirrored the statues of athletes and heroes. Women faced impossible standards of modesty and fertility, their worth tied to appearance and childbearing ability. Cosmetics and elaborate hairstyles attempted to bridge the gap, but most women lived under constant scrutiny, judged not only by family, but by the entire community. For slaves and laborers, appearance mattered less, but their very humanity was often ignored, reducing them to tools rather than people. And then there was the ever-present threat of violence. Wars between city-states were frequent, and military service was mandatory for men. A Spartan or Athenian could be called to fight at any time, and campaigns dragged citizens from their fields and workshops, sometimes never to return. Pirates prowled the seas, bandits lurked on the roads, and even in the heart of the city, disputes could erupt into deadly confrontations. Without police forces or hospitals, as we know them, safety was fragile at best. All of this was layered with constant uncertainty. Famine, drought, earthquakes, and plagues struck without warning, and the explanations always returned to divine will. Ordinary people had little control over their fates. Instead, they were swept along by forces larger than themselves, both natural and divine. In such a world, the idea of individual freedom, the sense that you could shape your own destiny, was nearly non-existent. Looking back, it becomes clear why we, modern people, would not last a day in ancient Greece. It was not simply the lack of technology or comfort, but the crushing weight of obligation, superstition, and survival. Life was harder, shorter, and far more uncertain than anything most of us can imagine. And yet, it was within this world that philosophy, democracy, literature, and art blossomed. The brilliance of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, the dramas of Sophocles and Euripides, the temples that still stand today, all of these emerged from a society that demanded so much and gave so little. That tension, the gap between the hardships of daily life and the enduring achievements of culture, is what makes ancient Greece so fascinating. It is a reminder that human creativity often thrives under the harshest conditions, that beauty can grow from struggle, and that the resilience of ordinary people, even in impossible circumstances, should never be underestimated. So while we admire the ruins and the myths, we should also remember the people who lived in their shadow. They were not gods nor heroes, but men and women trying to endure a world of endless demands. And for us, transported back to their streets, their farms, their temples, we would likely collapse under the strain before the day was done. Ancient Greece, for all its wonders, was not built to be kind. It was built to survive, and survival in that world was anything but easy.
you.